Okay. Whew, that's a lot. I will take whatever questions you guys have for as long as I can take them.
So I'm Jonathan Keene. I'm the resident Space Force nerd. So listen to your brief. A lot going on there. A lot of good information. If I had to condense all that down and provide like the two-sentence gist, it basically boiled down to the world is hosed, the geopolitical order is going to crash, and we are in for massive disruptions in both energy, and there's going to be massive wars and population collapse in the next couple of decades.
Yep.
So obviously, as a national security strategist, in air quotes, if you will, that's a cause for concern. I mean, what thoughts do you see a way for the U.S. and our larger Western allies to navigate that and avoid that situation, or do you see it as inevitable?
I think the Ukraine war made it, well, let me back up. The last president that we had that wanted to prepare for a post-Cold War system that would not be a free-for-all was George Herbert Walker Bush. And he tried to get us to have a conversation about what sort of world we wanted to live in. And we voted him out of office for it. And then we elected Clinton, who was, let's just say, distracted, and W, who was distracted by a specific region, and Obama, who didn't like to talk to anyone, Trump, who liked to yell at everyone, and now Biden, who is the most economically nationalist president we have had since Hoover. We haven't started the conversation in this country about what we want. And until we do, it's difficult to come up with a military strategy because right now we don't have a goal to point the military at. You guys are still operating under the last set of strategic guidance that you got in 1989. It has not been updated since then. And everything out of our procurement and our weapons development system reflects that. Until such time that we have that conversation with ourselves, this is all unavoidable. You could even argue that we're so far advanced now in the demographic decay, and with the Ukraine war being kind of a hard stop of the globalized era, that we're now well past the point of no return. The American people find Ukraine interesting. They don't see it as a threat yet. They're just curious about it because it's the first time since 1989 that something has come across the foreign policy screen that is more than playing whack-a-mole with Islamic terrorists. And that's almost refreshing, I guess. If our goal is to hold up the civilizational ceiling in some meaningful way, that means some version of a return to de facto subsidizing the security of a large number of countries. The question is who makes the cut? And that again requires first that conversation about what it is we want. So the reason I'm so certain that Biden is going to end the oil export ban this year, reinstate the export ban this year, is we haven't had that conversation. And so the very concept of economic after effects isn't even entering into policy at the moment. And while I'm glad that the Biden administration has engaged on the Ukraine war, I had my doubts. There is not even the start of the process of doing more. And if you look at what we're doing with Ukraine, there's no economic aspect whatsoever, especially as it relates to the allies. So the Russians are going to have this challenge to the German system very soon, and the Americans are going to have a challenge to the energy system very soon. And we're going to have a very clear idea of what our trajectory is going to be by September. And I can't say I'm hopeful from a globalization point of view. From a military point of view, I would argue that the Ukraine war is going swimmingly. It's going to be a long time till we prevent the Russians from being able to be functional in a military scheme. But the fact that the Ukrainians have done what they've done with the weapons that they've had, and now they're getting some seriously heavy gear, I'm optimistic.
I'm Colonel Vlasi from Romania. First of all, I want to thank you for your enlightening presentation. Although I have to admit, at least the first part was kind of disturbing. Romania is...
Anyone who is not disturbed by the Russians going to war has not been paying attention.
So considering that European Union, probably in the blueprint was mainly an economic and social project or experiment.
Certainly.
Never, maybe there was a whisper or a dream to become a political one. What's going on now in Europe? It seems that Russia invasion in Ukraine succeeded what the European failed, and the EU is about to become a successful story from the political stand. But the way you portrayed the situation with this energy crisis, is EU gonna survive as an economic, entity without having support from United States? Do you see a future for?
We're certainly in the witching hour. We're certainly in the time of testing. Europe's demographic decline is so advanced that it's well past the point of no return. That's as true in Germany as it is in Italy and Romania. The only way that the European Union can survive as an economic entity is if some version of globalized trade, specifically with access to the US market, continues. And it is not clear to me that that is going to happen. Again, the Biden administration is more nationalist and populist on economic issues than any other president we've had in the last century. And without access to global resources, it's difficult to imagine not just the Chinese system surviving in its current form, but also the European one. The proximate risk, of course, is what happens with Turkey and Germany in the very short term. So we will have a good feel for how much the Germans are willing to suffer in the name of European unity this summer. I don't know. This is Germany's first real decision since 1945. We have n equals 0. We have no idea what they're going to do when they're put under that kind of pressure. And then as for the question you didn't ask in Romania, the Russians feel they need to reach the Danube Delta. So they need to cross the Prut. They don't need to conquer half the country like it probably will be for Poland. But you will definitely feel it, because that means you will lose access to Danube transport.
We have seen that bullet coming, sir.
Oh.
I'm not revealing any secret. All our plans are tailored on this.
I'm glad to hear you're worrying about the right
and
thing.
That's why we've been gearing up and buying and trying to modernize and change our military capabilities in order to cope and handle that situation.
Yeah. If I may be so bold, I think that once we get to that point, the question will be just how well Bulgaria and Romania get along with Turkey, because you will need Turkish forces to stop it.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Hi, this is Mace Carpenter. Again, great briefing. I try to help with energy, and you've really knitted the social, the geopolitical economy with energy, and thanks. My question is, what are the steps that you see that the U.S. can take to help the climate, both internally and in a leadership role?
Sure. In my opinion, the green techs we have today are not sufficient to the task. And in most places, if they are applied at scale, it actually increases the problem. So my recommendation would be a massive series of grants to tertiary educational institutions to improve the material science of every aspect of the green revolution, whether that's generation with solar and wind, and especially coming up with a much better and simpler battery chemistry that does not require the current supply chain system to work. Smart money is chasing these things, but it needs to be expanded by at least a factor of 100. And I would prefer to see most of the money that we're investing into rolling out a technology that we know doesn't work be applied to developing technologies that will work. Because if our goal is to really lower not just American carbon intensity, but global carbon intensity, we have to come up with a simple supply chain system, a simple manufacturing system that functions at low cost so that other countries can apply these technologies as well. The United States is steadily decarbonizing, and we can continue to do that in a deglobalized system, but most of the rest of the world can't. So we need to come up with a system that is appropriate in other places. And we're unfortunately just not moving that direction very quickly at all.
Good morning, Peter. It's Ruth Ann. How are you today?
Hey, Ruth Ann, how you doing?
Doing great. Hey, question for you on the nuclear front, and if you don't want to talk about that, I appreciate that.
Oh,
but most of the raw material nuclear chain right now comes out of Russia, and I understand that there are other places.
Russia, Kazakhstan, yeah.
Yes, that it can come out of. My question is, given the challenges that we have with the flow of crude right now, do you see countries like Germany possibly looking to reopen their nuclear? And then do you also see a potential supply chain that is not from that region? Over.
Sure. So the problem in Germany, of course, is that the Greens have staked their political existence on ending the nuclear program, and they see nuclear power fuels as a worse solution than soft coal. So that's an internal ideological disconnect that exists within the German system. I would expect once it becomes clear that a lot of this stuff is going to go off, a lot of the fossil fuel stuff is going to go offline in Europe anyway, that for them to bite the bullet and turn some of those things back on. I think that's where we're going to end before the end of this year. For the broader question on supply chain, the problem is Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan produces more uranium than I think the next 5 countries put together. Australia and Canada are both in the top 3, and Australia is rapidly expanding output while Canadian output is crashing just because of the capacity of the mines are falling in Canada, whereas the Australians are expanding. So it's not that we don't have any uranium, we just don't have enough. In the midterm, while we're waiting for countries like especially Australia to expand output, if we want to continue with nuclear power fuel as part of the equation, we are going to have to, in this country, build out better reprocessing facilities to harvest the spent fuel and recycle some of it into new fuel. That will get us about 3/4 of the way that we need to go. The problem we have is that when the Cold War ended, we decided to spin down all of our uranium-based weapons into electricity generating civilian fuel. It was a great plan. It got rid of 20,000 weapons in Russia. We'd be in a much worse position from a strategic point of view today if we hadn't done that. But it did mean that for 15 years, American nuclear supply chain folks that were in the fuel side got put out of business. And now we import most of it. Now, those facilities are still there, but we're going to have a labor problem because it's been 20 years now since that started. But if we can bring those up online, if we can respin some of the spent nuclear fuel, we're going to be fine. But that would be the sort of thing that I would like to think we would have started 4 years ago, when we, especially in 2008, when we got the sign of just how aggressive the Russians were going to be, but we have not. So we're starting from scratch like we are with so many things. So I expect instead that we will expand coal use in the midterm until we can bring nuke stuff back online, barring an act of Congress that mandates certain things. And with the shift from Obama to Trump to Biden, the country's political mood has turned more and more populist, and we might be getting to the point where there's a push in Congress for blatantly interventionist economic policy from the federal government, which would speed some of this up. Whether that's good, bad, or indifferent, of course, depends upon your view of everything from coal and nuclear to wind to the role of government in the economy. It's a thorny issue, but nothing focuses the mind quite like a blackout.
To extend that conversation, and thank you, I appreciate that insight. And when you and I get together, we'll chat on that topic. shale has been a boon for the United States.
Mhm.
My question is, are there other places in the world, particularly that are going to be the most hard hit, that can also start their own shale revolution? And do you see the U.S. supporting its allies in actually creating shale economies in other geographic locations? Over.
The U.S. has a policy within the Department of Energy to poke at that a little bit, but they haven't had a lot of success because the geology isn't as good as it is in the United States. In the United States, just a quirk of geology, when our sedimentary beds formed during the age of the dinosaurs, it happened 4 or 5 times in most places, and in the Permian, it happened 11 times. So that's one of the reasons why when you drill into the Delaware Basin, you hit like 11 petroleum-bearing zones with one vertical shaft, and it's fantastic. The world's second and third largest shale sectors are Canada, primarily for natural gas, and Argentina, because they've got a similar geology and they already have infrastructure going to the fields, and their equivalent of the Permian is actually closer to Buenos Aires than the Permian is to, say, Dallas and Houston. So those two are actually doing pretty well. Everywhere else, it's totally on the back burner. A big problem is that there is not another country on the planet where the subsoil can belong to a private entity. And if the landowners on the surface are not getting a cut of anything, then of course they're going to oppose production on their land. That's certainly the problem that the Brits and the Poles had when they started poking at this about 10 years ago. And so we still don't have meaningful production. There's also the problem in that in other shale areas where they do overlap with population centers, they overlap a little bit too well. So we've got the Eagle Ford, which is just south of San Antonio, which makes San Antonio and Houston perfect for oil absorption. But in France, the best basin they have is literally under Paris, and the densest concentration is directly under the Louvre. So can you imagine having a frac set up next to that big pyramid? And it's not something they're willing to consider right now. Now, again,
that's why it goes with the architecture.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, in California, we've put a oil well in a mall, and one is disguised as a synagogue. So it's possible, but you have to have a degree of public acceptance. And until we have blackouts, I don't think that's going to happen. Australia has some, but they don't have the water. There's some great shale in Russia, but it's in the Bazanov, and it's like 1,000 miles from any place where anyone would ever want to live. So it's just we don't have it lined up. I think we're more likely to see shale developments in North Africa than we are in Europe. And North Africa has conventional they're going to burn through first. They'd have to import an entire cadre of staff to do otherwise, which means the only one that I expect to join the shale club with any speed or fervor is probably going to be Mexico. Because Texans think of Mexico as a neighbor. They don't even think of it as a foreign country. And so in exporting the staff necessary to Mexico to make it work, that's kind of a slam dunk. But that's not going to happen under this president. You'll have to have a liberalization of Mexican energy laws first. And as long as the United States can export refined product to Mexico, they're not going to have a blackout. But that's where it would be most likely.
As we're moving from a policy perspective to investments in renewables, from your lecture, we understand that there are going to be obvious disruptions to the supply chain. So how can the U.S. government, what can we do from a policy perspective or an investment economic perspective to keep that push going forward? Or is this sort of doomed given where we may go with the supply chains?
It's not doomed. Silicon is easy to source. It's in quartz rocks everywhere. It's like the 4th most regular element in the crust. So that's not the problem. There are various things that go into that besides copper, and the Biden administration has used the Defense Industries Act to force the sourcing of more of that closer to home. I'm not sure that's quite the right tool for the job, but it's not a bad tool for the job. The problem is going to be the purification of the silicon in the first step. So it's a 3-step process. Number 1, you mine the ore, the quartz. Number 2, you throw it into a foundry, kind of like a blast furnace for steel, where you just heat it until everything that is not silicon boils away. And that gives you something that's roughly 99% silicon. That's great for glass and industrial uses and silicones like fake boobs and kitchen equipment, but that's no good for solar. For that, you need 99.999999%. Now, that second stage, the US is very good at. We have exported the first stage to countries that don't give two shits about environmental issues like China and Russia. So we need to resource or reshore that first processing stage. Once that is done, we're better at the second stage than almost anybody else. We can fabricate the solar panels at a competitive price. And then we have a final stage, which is assembly. And because of all the wires, we do not yet have a process to automate that. So mining the quartz, no problem. First blast stage, technologically simple, but environmentally damaging. Second stage, we already do. Third stage, we already do with the manufacturer. Assembly is going to have to be someone else. I'm not certain that the Mexicans are cheap enough labor to do that at scale. We might need to find another partner. My personal preference would be Colombia. We already have a free trade deal with them. They already have excellent relationships with both the United States and with Mexico. And in terms of value add per labor price point, they're arguably one of the most efficient countries in the world. But we're talking here about building up a supply chain that does not currently exist in the Western Hemisphere for 2 of the 5 steps. If we start now and there's a lot of government push behind it, that's still a 2 to 3 year process.
This is Ruth Ann again. I do want to go back. There's been military strategies, particularly in the Army, that are embracing the electric and hybrid vehicle. You gave a wonderful kind of overview on that. So if I just want to better understand that as we look to make technology investments, you are what you see out in the world is that unless we go fully electric around the world, that having electric tactical vehicles is not going to be beneficial potentially to the U.S. military. And so if that is the case, then there's you would recommend that we look to put our technology investment dollars in potentially other areas. Did I understand kind of where you were coming from on that?
If you're forcing me to make a forecast or a recommendation on that, I would broadly agree. I am all for the military playing with every technology that is out there. Because the military is not driven by normal business considerations, you can take risks that the corporate community just can't. And in many times it generates materials or processes that then become the norm across the world. If it wasn't for what the military needed to do with spy technologies and satellites, we would not have cellular communications right now. So I'm never going to say no. That said, an electric vehicle with today's technology with a lithium cobalt-based battery simply doesn't charge fast enough, discharge fast enough, or hold enough charge to be useful in a military context unless you bring enough diesel to run massive local generators in order to charge it, which from my point of view is actually complicating and increasing your carbon footprint rather than shrinking it. So yes, with today's technology, it just doesn't work. If you change the technology, if we get better material science, I reserve the right to change my mind. Change the facts, I'm going to change my mind. That's just how this is going to work. Fuel cells, I think, show a little bit more promise because they can hold more and stored charge. They have a better energy density than a lithium battery. But everything is going to be determined by where you are. So for example, we now have the technology to do small modular nuclear reactors. The smaller ones can be transported on a flatbed semi. Shockingly small. You pair that in a deployment situation with an electric fleet, I'll change my mind because all of a sudden you have brought your fuel depot with you and it doesn't have a logistical tail. Now, there's obviously issues of defense and contamination should something go horribly wrong. And we all know that in ground operations, you plan for things going horribly wrong. But I don't think we're to the stage that, how should I say this? The Biden administration says, oh yeah, the nuclearization of the power system for the military, yeah, that's the path forward. But with today's EVs, that's the only way to make it work in a war scenario.
Thank you, Peter. This was absolutely fantastic. What you were really able to do, I think, for our energy seminar was really take everything that we've learned this semester and kind of tie it all together, in terms of the politics, the sector, the markets, and the socio-political environment, and how all of that, brings us to where we are today. And really enjoyed listening to your insights of what might be coming. And you gave us a lot of things to think about, things we should be looking at that maybe we hadn't thought about looking at before in terms of the Ukraine and Russia and China. So on behalf of the Energy Seminar, thank you so much for taking the time. Really, really appreciate it. This has been invaluable for us. So